I've spent a moderate amount of time there. It's obviously, in some ways, this society that copied the West like crazy. And then in some ways, the forms also stayed very different from the West culturally. I probably always approach these things through somewhat of an economic lens. There was some kind of manufacturing, export oriented growth model that Japan was able to perfect and to do incredibly well at. And there was,
Mainly Toyota?
well, it was Toyota. I mean, I think it started with all sorts of silly games, and then
Mhm.
eventually it moved up into like small cars and then more luxury cars. There was a big semiconductor part to this. There were all kinds of sort of very complicated industrial machinery. And of course, there was a pre-World War II history too, where you had the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, and somehow Japan radically modernized incredibly fast in the 19th century. It was one of the very few societies that wasn't, simply overwhelmed by the West in the 19th, early 20th century. It was very traditional, but somehow, they were able to turn it, to radically transform it. Commodore Perry shows up in Tokyo Harbor, 1850s or whenever that is, and it's been this closed society for almost 200 years. And then within 20, 30 years, it radically transforms. It also advances on the military side very quickly. It's 1905 where they defeat Russia. Wow, Japan by 1905 is strong enough to defeat one of the great European powers. And then, yeah, it obviously goes haywire with the fascism and the militarism in the 30s and 40s. But then, yeah, after World War II ends, there is some way the energy gets channeled in this relatively peaceful, but aggressive modernization. It ends up being incredibly competitive. It violates every free trade theory one would have because it's super mercantilist. You have all sorts of, effectively you have massive tariffs in Japan on any goods that get produced outside of Japan, and then culturally people don't buy them. And so there's a way the consumer standards of living are relatively low. It's this, unbelievably competitive machine. And in some ways, there are these processes they do better where it becomes more efficient and smoother functioning. And then it somehow hits a wall in the 80s and 90s. Again, maybe the 0 to 1 prism I'm tempted to give on it is that there's some point where they more or less caught up with the US, but then they needed to do something new. And it was just not geared towards innovation at all. It was process innovation of the sort where you build a more efficient factory, but it was not, inventing radically new things. And then maybe the globalization piece that worked for Japan, where you had, the labor was cheaper, the environmental standards were more lax than in the US. And so you had this sort of arbitrage. Then the Asian tigers start to apply the same to Japan, where it's cheaper to have a manufacturing plant in South Korea or Taiwan or Southeast Asia. And then by the 2000s, China does the Japan playbook against Japan. And so the sort of manufacturing tradable goods, we build goods that you can trade globally, was extremely powerful, but it had this hidden problem because there were billions of other people who were paid even less that might eventually catch up with you. And, China wasn't necessarily going to just keep the Cultural Revolution and the mass insanity going forever. And so yeah, the Japan thing worked extremely well when it was the only country in the world doing it, but then it had some hidden problems with it. And there's always a part of me that thinks something that went wrong in the US is that we de-stressed manufacturing a great deal. We have these incredible trade deficits, current account deficits, which doesn't seem like that good a way to run the economy. But the problem we don't have that Japan ran into is there's some way where the US has to compete much less directly with labor in other countries. And people in the US They're basically in these non-tradable service sector jobs. And there's some way in which the US is the most immune from global competition, which is good and bad things to it.